Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Week 2 in the books. Time to update the SEC power rankings heading into week 3. I think I got two takeaways from a rocky power rankings that I put out 7 days ago. I had Auburn, I had Kentucky, both in the dark horse tier. Obviously, you look at Hugh Freeze and Auburn, just tricked me. I watched that game against Alabama A&M and say, look at all the firepower that they were able to get from the high school recruiting trail in the transfer portal. And then I just forget that Peyton Thorne is what he is, still at quarterback for Auburn. Obviously, a tough loss to Cal. And then you look at Kentucky, just simply can't pass protect. And I think we all know that if you can't pass protect in the SEC, you ain't going to be that good. And then I think another thing you're noticing, at least in my opinion, I think the top teams in this conference are really starting to separate. You look at Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Missouri. Obviously, Missouri, Ole Miss haven't really played great competition. Alabama, kind of a rocky early portion of the game, but when they wanted to turn on the heat, step on the gas, they pulled away. Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, like those teams look like maybe three of the best teams that we see across the country. And so I think there's kind of a separation that's going on in terms of the teams that really can compete at the highest level. You look at LSU, Oklahoma, two programs that still have some massive question marks that they have to answer as we get into SEC play. Fired up to get into this one now. Before we do, and as always, most importantly, let it fly in the comment section. I just showed 7 days ago these rankings ain't always that great. You guys let it fly last week. I expect y'all to let it fly this week. Appreciate y'all rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's start at the top, right? Georgia. I think Georgia won the week because you look at what Georgia did to Clemson week 1 and then what Clemson just did to App State week 2. That is makes me even more comfortable about Georgia being not only the best team in the country, but in the SEC. I think Texas showed that they're probably the number 2 team, not only in the country, but in the SEC as well, going up on the road to Ann Arbor and just boxing Michigan. I mean, Texas, I'm a Michigan fan, and Michigan has won a lot of football games in terms of just being the more physical football program along the lines of scrimmage. I think Texas can show that they can win those kind of games in the SEC. They can be one of the best line of scrimmage teams that you see in the country, but at the same time, they can win with a lot of firepower on the outside. I thought that was maybe not according to the box score, but you go and watch that first half from Quinn Ewers. I don't think we've seen Quinn Ewers play like that in terms of extending plays, pushing the ball down the field, making some throws that we all know he can make, but just kind of make your jaw drop. Like Quinn Ewers was phenomenal. And then Tennessee. I think your biggest takeaway from Tennessee is Nico didn't even play that good of a football game. Tennessee went and played NC State. NC State ran the football for 39 total yards. NC State is the bully in the ACC. I think you can see a little bit of that conference difference there, where Tennessee comes and just physically imposes their will against an NC State team that, one, I think is pretty damn good, but most notably is normally very good along the lines of scrimmage. This Tennessee team ain't just Nico at quarterback. I think Josh Heupel has got the line of scrimmage play where he needs it to be. What's the biggest difference between Tennessee this year and then what we saw in 2022? It's a much more complete team. I think they still have very good quarterback play. I think they have very talented wide receivers. Obviously, Josh Heupel running the offense. The biggest difference, though, is that this Tennessee team is really good along the lines of scrimmage. Alabama, sloppy 3 quarters. You got to figure out the offensive line. We all know what this team can do when they want to turn it on. Ole Miss, pretty much unstoppable in terms of what their offenses look like. Granted, not great competition. I think Jackson Dart has more touchdowns that he's accounted for than incompletions that he's thrown. This Ole Miss offense looks like what we thought it was. This Ole Miss team, I think, looks like they are on paper. Now, it's kind of the biggest question is, can Ole Miss play like they are on paper? Because we all saw what they did in the transfer portal. Now, can they put it on the football field? Again, you haven't seen them play top-end competition. They've certainly looked apart throughout the first 2 weeks in Missouri. Nobody scored a point on Missouri yet. They play Boston College at home this week and maybe a little better of a feel of how good Missouri is. Make no mistake about it. A title contender, especially with the schedule that they have. Now, getting into the dark horse tier, LSU, Oklahoma. Let's start with LSU, where I'm liking what Blake Baker's doing with the defense. It's a much more aggressive defense. They're running a lot more single high safety, a lot more pressure packages, which I'm a fan of because you go back to LSU last year, it was just a lot of really soft zone coverage and just letting teams work the football up the field on them. I think LSU still has a ways to go in terms of the personnel. Look, they want to leave their defensive backs on islands. I don't necessarily know if they're quite there in terms of the personnel of their defensive backs to hold up on those islands, but at least they are trying to impact the quarterback. They're trying to create turnovers and create negative plays. I think that's a step in the right direction. The offense looks great, right? Offensive line, Garrett Nussmeier, I believe, definitely at the top of the leaderboard in terms of passing touchdowns so far through 2 seasons or 2 games, excuse me. Then you look at Oklahoma, and I was very close to putting Oklahoma into the next tier down because they haven't looked apart. My biggest concern for Oklahoma, I think this defense is a very quality defense in the SEC. I think there is talent on the offensive side of the football. Obviously, they're a little banged up right now, but that offensive line, it's not that good right now. And I do think they have the pieces. They're shuffling the deck on the offensive line. But if you go into SEC play and you play Tennessee in week 4 with that kind of offensive line, it's just not a recipe to win a lot of football games in the SEC. So if I see this Oklahoma offensive line take a step, if they can somehow figure out that unit, they can certainly be a dark horse in this conference. But they got to figure out the offensive line because just like we talked about with Kentucky and like we all know in the SEC, if you cannot establish the line of scrimmage and you are a liability on the offensive line, you're not going to win a lot of football games in this conference. Going into the teams on the outside looking in, I feel pretty good about the teams in this tier. I don't necessarily know if I feel good about how I stack them. I'm going Texas A&M number 1 in this tier. I still think the defense is just loaded with NFL talent. I don't think Connor Wigman had a week 2 that just made you feel great about what this Texas A&M offense can be. I think the offensive line actually has been okay. I think the biggest question is Connor Wigman a quarterback that you can win a lot of football games with in the SEC? I certainly thought so heading into 2024. It certainly hasn't looked that way throughout the first 2 games. Auburn, I think this is a quality Auburn team that one turned the football over far too much. The offensive line certainly has some question marks, but again, Peyton Thorne, similar conversation that we have with Texas A&M. Is that a quarterback that you feel comfortable winning a lot of SEC games with? I leave the Auburn fans to answer that question and Hugh Freeze to answer that question because he obviously has to kind of try to figure out what the quarterback position is going to look like over the next couple of weeks. Florida, this is a little high for Florida, and it more has me to do with other teams and question marks I have about the other teams. Like South Carolina, legit pass rush. And granted, they played Kentucky, which I think has a very shoddy offensive line, but they got dudes. Dylan Stewart might be one of the best pass rushers in the country as a true freshman. I think the secondary has suddenly looked much better because they actually have a pass rush on the defensive line. But I would ask South Carolina fans, like, did the performance on offense, and again, Lenore Sellers in the box score 11 to 15, solid. Do we have a ton of confidence in the South Carolina offense just yet? I think we're going to get our answer because LSU is coming to town this week. I think that's going to be a very fun game, and we're going to learn a lot about the South Carolina team specifically on the offensive side of the football. Arkansas, uh, just they won that football game in just about every way you could win it besides on the scoreboard against Oklahoma State. Watched every single snap of that game more than once. This is a pretty solid team. I think the offensive line is substantially better. Taylon Green is a difference maker at quarterback. I think Jaquinton Jackson can run the rock. The defense has made some improvements. I just don't know how they lost that game against Oklahoma State. And then, quite frankly, it's the same story for Arkansas. Like, they're just not winning when it matters. And that matters when you talk about trying to rank these teams in the SEC. Kentucky, massive problems on the offensive line. I do think that defense is actually still pretty dang good. They were just put in some really bad spots against South Carolina. But again, if you have problems like that on the offensive line, it's going to be a long season in the SEC. Vanderbilt and Mississippi State. Look, Vanderbilt is scrappy. They got a scrappy quarterback. They have a scrappy team. And then Mississippi State, I don't know if they have their identity yet, but I think more importantly, like we talk about Vanderbilt not having SEC caliber talent, like Mississippi State specifically along the lines of scrimmage, they kind of got Arizona State ran the football for over 250 yards against them. Arizona State's not a very good team in the Big 12. I have massive question marks about what this Mississippi State team is specifically along the lines of scrimmage. And then Vanderbilt. Look, I think we all know Vanderbilt from a talent standpoint is far below a lot of those teams above them. They are punching, at least in my mind, above their weight. I mean, again, that Virginia Tech win at home to open the week, that was very impressive. Now, we'll see if they can kind of continue some of that momentum in the SEC. Again, I think the talent is not quite there. But I think Diego Pavi at quarterback is a gritty dude, state champ wrestler from New Mexico. I could see Vanderbilt winning a game in the SEC from just kind of figuring out how to win ugly. And that's going to be the recipe for Vanderbilt really as long as they're in the SEC because they ain't going to have the talent that other SEC teams do. So you got to find other ways to win. And quite frankly, it looks like a Vanderbilt team that might be able to find some other ways to win. They're doing some weird things on the offensive line, which, hey, like I'm a fan of. Like try to pull out all the stops in terms of maximizing your talent on your football team. That's what Vanderbilt's doing. We'll close it down there. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.